Hi guys, today I will be covering the topic of implicit bias. It can be lumped together with prejudice and stereotypes because they involve a lot of the same mechanisms, and in a lot of ways implicit bias can lead to prejudice and stereotypes. I know there's a lot of political tension, especially about police brutality and things to that extent about this topic. I don't consider myself political by any means, but I chose this topic because I thought it would be challenging for me. And I believe the only way we can expect to grow is by challenging ourselves and challenging our biases. So let's get started. So we will be covering 5 big ideas throughout the presentation. We'll start by defining implicit bias. Next, we will discuss how it is measured. Then we'll understand the importance of studying implicit bias. We'll talk about implicit bias in the schools. And then finally, we'll discuss ways that have been proposed to reduce implicit bias. So first, I would like to begin by mentioning a related but distinct construct, and that is explicit bias. Explicit bias is a type of bias we are consciously aware of, and it can be directly measured by administering a survey. On the other hand, implicit bias is a mental process that happens outside of conscious awareness. So implicit biases are biases we are not consciously aware of, regardless of our intentions. Implicit biases commonly occur with activation of attitudes, stereotypes, and prejudice. Stereotypes are overgeneralizations about a particular group of people. An example of this is Asians are good at math. Black people are athletic and fast. Blondes are not intelligent. So those are some that you're probably familiar with. Prejudice describes attitudes or judgments that are not grounded in reason. Prejudice can be the product of implicit bias and stereotypical beliefs. Although this presentation will focus on implicit bias, there is an important interrelationship between all of these terms, which encompass the construct of implicit bias. So to understand how implicit bias works, we need a good understanding of how knowledge works, because our experiences shape our knowledge of the world, which can also lead to certain biases. So you can probably recall that we store information in long-term memory. That can be thought of as our knowledge. And we organize that information into a schema. A schema is a mental representation of information we store in memory about specific objects, people, places, or concepts. So I kind of just threw that definition together based off of what I've remembered from previous courses. So as you can see, I created my own self-schema of the things that were accessible to my schema of who I am. I included some of my deepest values and my roles. All these things kind of just instantly came to mind. Didn't take me very long to put that together. Which leads to another concept. So certain knowledge is easily accessible after repeated activation, and this is referred to as chronic accessibility. So kindness is a very important value or virtue to me. It's important to me that I'm kind to other people and that other people are kind to each other. And so that's something that's been repeatedly activated over and over again for me, because I obviously see it as a part of who I am. So when I thought about my self-schema, that was something that was readily available because it was chronically accessed, I guess you would say. So I have a question. How do you think chronic accessibility can lead to bias? So I encourage you to stop and think about it before you move on to the next slide. Hopefully the answer to that question becomes apparent as we're moving through the presentation, but just in case, I included a video that kind of lays out the answer for you. What I'm trying to get out here is that when certain knowledge is readily available, we often use heuristics or mental shortcuts to access them. So the video actually explains availability heuristics and representative heuristics, which we should have already learned about, but I think the video does a great job. Hopefully you found that video helpful in understanding heuristics. Other than heuristics, there's another concept within psychology that is important for understanding implicit bias, and that is the dual processing theory. If you can recall, the dual processing theory is a theory within cognitive psych that identifies two major systems or modes of thinking. So I kind of included an image here that gives you a quick rundown of what's under each system, but we use these systems while carrying out tasks, making decisions, and problem solving. System 1 is hypothesized to act outside of conscious awareness, and it is thought to be both automatic and effortless. Much of what happens under System 1 is thought to be involuntary. On the other hand, System 2 is slow, methodical, and effortful. So we engage System 2 when making complex decisions. So just based off of this information, which system do you think is hypothesized to be most responsible for the presence of implicit bias? If you said System 1, you would be correct. Now that we know what implicit bias is and how it works, how do we measure it and why should we measure it? Implicit measures use indirect methods of measuring bias through priming, response latency, and categorization errors. So we might use priming to indirectly activate implicit biases or attitudes and use another measure to determine the outcome of activating that bias. An example of this might be if we're interested in how race influences affect. So we might begin by priming an individual with an image of a black or white face, and then we later measure their affect by administering a questionnaire. So that's one example. So priming is commonly used as a way of indirectly manipulating implicit bias. Response latency is a measure of how quickly or slowly participants respond to stimuli. This measure operates from the assumption that if individuals are quicker to respond to one category over another, they have an implicit bias for that category. So this is often observed in racial bias when we're looking at shooter bias, where participants are quicker to shoot black perpetrators with or without a weapon. Categorization errors are just what they sound like. So participants are asked to categorize certain attributes to certain constructs or groups of people, such as pairing negative and positive words with particular gender group, such as male versus female. Then they measure the number of errors that occurred during the test. There are a lot of ways to measure implicit bias, but the implicit association test is the most widely used and validated measure of implicit bias. It provides instructions, practice trials, and then several experimental trials where the participants are covertly tasked with pairing negative or positive words with different types of constructs such as race, disability, or products. So if you're interested in consumer preferences, then you would want to study whether consumers are more biased towards buying generic versus name brand products. That's just one example. If participants are faster at categorizing one group of images over another, they are assumed to have an implicit bias towards that group. So I included a link here for you to kind of join in an activity with me. We might share kind of our opinion of the test and discuss it. You don't have to share your results on Wednesday, but I've included that for you to kind of get an understanding of how the IAT works. I also wanted to discuss D. So D is a measure of effect size for implicit bias. It has an index, a numerical index of +2 to -2. And so the closer the score is to 2, that means the more implicit bias that person has. The positive and negative is just referring to the dichotomy. So if you're comparing implicit bias for white versus black individuals, and positive means white and negative means black, then the more positive, so the closer the score is to 2, and whether the score is positive or not indicates that you have a white bias, so bias towards white individuals. Also, I wanted to cover some of the limitations to self-report, because that's the reason we measure implicit bias. So with self-report, we run into the problem of social desirability. Some people won't report things even if they know them because they want to be viewed in a positive light by others. And so that's one problem we run into. Also, with explicit bias measures, they predict different things than implicit bias measures. With explicit bias, you can predict consumer behavior, political preferences. Implicit bias is better at predicting more covert behaviors such as interracial and intergroup behavior. So, as you probably already know by now, studying implicit bias is important because it impacts every decision we make, regardless of our intentions. It exists in the schools, and you can tell this by looking at the disproportionate amount of special education and discipline referrals for minority students. Our current behavioral or disciplinary systems, such as PBIS or behavioral RTI, is reducing these disparities in out-of-school suspensions, but they're still pretty substantial. Here in a little bit, we'll get more into teachers' implicit attitudes about minority students. But on a different note, implicit bias also exists in the criminal justice system. Studies have illustrated that police officers are more likely to stop, search, arrest, and use force against black individuals than white individuals. But the interesting part of these studies is that even after controlling for differential crime participation by race, these disparities still exist. For example, one study that examined shooter bias controlled for racial differences in crime participation and still found that participants were biased towards shooting unarmed black men. And a meta-analysis on shooter bias found that participants were more likely to shoot unarmed black men as well. Implicit bias is also present in the healthcare system. One review that studied implicit racial bias in healthcare providers found that out of 35 studies, 26 studies demonstrated some pro-white bias or anti-black bias using some form of IAT, or implicit association test. Probably a more applicable finding for psychology majors is that implicit bias is associated with poor anticipated client-therapist bonds, and another study showed that level of empathy toward the client is also associated with implicit racial bias. So those are important things to be aware of going into our professions. I didn't do a lot of reading about bias within research, but we know that this is a concern because of confirmation bias. If you don't remember, confirmation bias is the tendency to interpret new evidence as confirmation of one's existing beliefs or theories. And despite the efforts of researchers and psychologists to be objective in how they carry out their research, multiple disciplines still let their biases impact their work without knowing it. And that's why we have systems such as peer review in place. I wanted to get a little bit more in depth on the importance of studying implicit bias in the schools for us school psych majors. So I included a study that specifically looks at teachers' attitudes towards ethnic minority students. So research leading up to this point shows experience with more ethnically diverse students should reduce negative attitudes or biases towards culturally and ethnically diverse students. This is related to Alport's contact hypothesis, the idea that intergroup contact, cooperation, and equal status can reduce implicit bias and in turn reduce prejudice. So this study examines this idea a little further. Although they recorded several variables such as gender, age, experience, the main variables under investigation were school composition. So school composition is just the level of diversity within that school. So high cultural diversity versus low cultural diversity, and that was the independent variable. And they also were interested in seeing how school composition impacted implicit and explicit attitudes. So those were our primary dependent variables in the study. And so there were two studies. Study one looked at or hypothesized that confronting pre-service teachers with culturally diverse school settings might activate negative stereotypical beliefs, which could activate negative attitudes. Study two hypothesized that based on contact theory, we expect teachers who worked in less culturally diverse schools to show more negative attitudes towards ethnic minority students than teachers who worked at high culturally diverse schools. So the participants for study one were a sample of 45 pre-service teachers, and I thought it would be important to note the teacher composition because that might have a bearing on some of the results. So there were 55% German teachers. The study was done in Germany, and that's the majority ethnic group. And then there were 45% ethnic minority or Turkish teachers. For study two, they moved on to a associated difference or quasi-experimental design, and they included teachers who were either experienced in high diversity schools or low diversity schools. The sample size was 231, and there were 20% German teachers and 60% ethnic minority or Turkish teachers. So in study 1, the pre-service teachers gave consent to participate in the study. Then participants were randomly assigned to either the high or low cultural diversity condition. Then they were given a scenario to read, and then they were asked to imagine high cultural diversity or low cultural diversity in the scenario, depending on their assigned group. After that, they were given a computerized implicit association test. In phase 1, they categorized German names and Turkish names using the I and E keys on the keyboard. In phase 2, they were asked to categorize positive and negative words. And then in phase 3, they did the combination of both. So at the same time they were categorizing German names and Turkish names, they were also categorizing positive and negative words. So there are 40 practice trials and 80 test trials. Then they were given a questionnaire that measured explicit attitudes, and then they were debriefed. For the second study, they wanted to further explore the impact of intergroup contact of teachers and minority students, so they used experienced teachers and followed the same general procedure. So they provided consent. There was no random assignment this time, so it was more like an associated difference or quasi-experimental study. And participants were separated into groups based on a cutoff score. So if they estimated that the cultural diversity at their school was 50% or greater, they were in the high diversity group. If it was 50% or less, or just less than 50%, they were in the low diversity group. And so the independent variable was not actually manipulated in the study. This was, like I said, a quasi-experimental or associated difference design. Participants completed the IAT, or implicit association test, and explicit attitudes were measured using a different questionnaire than the first study. Then they were debriefed once again. As you can see, I decided to create my own figures to illustrate the results of study 1 and study 2. In study 1, they only looked at pre-service teachers, and there was a significant difference in implicit attitudes between high and low ethnicity conditions. And there was also a small to moderate effect size. Cohen's D was 0.39. You can tell by looking at the bar graph that participants who received the high diversity scenario exhibited more negative attitudes than participants who received a vignette for low ethnic diversity. So at the top of the bar, you see 1.02. That is the mean D score. And we kind of went over that index a little while ago when we were talking about +2 to -2. So higher scores are an indicator of more bias responses. Looking at study 2, they only studied experienced teachers, so whether they were experienced in high or low ethnically diverse conditions. So there was also a significant difference in implicit bias for experienced teachers between high and low ethnic diversity conditions, and there was a small effect size. Cohen's D was 0.28. The second study demonstrates that teachers who worked in high diversity schools held less negative implicit attitudes towards culturally diverse students, while teachers in low diversity conditions exhibited more negative implicit attitudes towards ethnically diverse students. And again, you can see that D for the high condition is 0.81, and for the low condition, the mean score for D was 1.04. Looking at Table 3, you can tell the only significant difference for explicit attitudes was the perceived effort for teachers. So I have that highlighted right here. And after priming pre-service teachers' implicit attitudes toward ethnically diverse students, teachers perceived that teaching students of diverse culture/ethnicity required more effort. And there was only a small to medium effect size for this. You can see 0.39 there as well. Because I want to stay focused on implicit bias, I'm not going to cover the correlations for explicit bias, but I will include them here for the sake of completion. And one of the things that the authors of this study noted was only self-efficacy beliefs were related to implicit attitudes. So that's one of the important things you need to know. For study 2, looking at explicit bias, there was no significant difference between groups in prejudiced beliefs, multicultural beliefs, or specific self-efficacy. However, there was a significant difference in enthusiasm depending on experience in high or low diversity schools. And the effect size was small to moderate. Cohen's D was 0.3. So teachers who worked at highly diverse schools were more enthusiastic towards teaching of ethnic minority students than teachers who worked at schools with low cultural diversity. Again, I have included the secondary analysis tables for your viewing, but only prejudiced beliefs were related to implicit attitudes in the low cultural diversity group. And this is the results from study 2. So all the articles that I read mentioned that some of these methods, empathy, perspective taking, individuation, training professionals, and contact hypothesis, they mentioned some of these ways for reducing or eliminating implicit bias. However, one of the articles that I read that was specifically looking at the criminal justice system says that these attempts, so empathy, perspective taking, training, these attempts at reducing disparities in the criminal justice system are not effective. Instead, they proposed alternatives that reduce the ability of important decision makers to act on their implicit biases. And they proposed to include that these people include multiple team members in high-stakes decision-making. They also proposed using interventions that lessen the impact of implicit bias on decisions and emphasizing the importance of accurate evaluation. So nothing says that they're correct in what they've proposed. All of these different things have been proposed, and it's really a matter of figuring it out. So currently we do not know which of these is the best solution to reducing implicit bias, but these ideas leave us with a starting point.